wind, a ghost of a typhoon that had bled itself out over the Philippines, now slid off the South China Sea like a thin, damp razor blade. It worried the cheap aluminum window frame of the Kowloon bolt hole, a high, keening whistle that was the city's true anthem. It was a sound Julian Croft had come to associate with Hong Kong's sleepless, grinding anxiety. A noise that seeped through the failing rubber seals of the 27th floor shoebox he'd called home for 11 months. He stood motionless in the manufactured chill of an overworked Gree air conditioner, the unit groaning under the Sisyphean task of battling the city's oppressive, lung-coating humidity. Goosebumps, tiny and sharp, prickled the skin on his forearms, a cold mockery of the permanent film of sweat that clung to the back of his neck. The room smelled of three things, a holy trinity of urban decay. The first was the persistent, mineral dampness of subtropical concrete, a scent like a wet cave or a freshly opened tomb. The second was the ghost of 1,000 meals cooked in the noodle shop directly below, a cloying, sweet and savory miasma of MSG, star anise, and frying pork fat that had permanently infused the cheap polyester curtains. The third, sharpest and most immediate, was the metallic tang of his own stress sweat, an acidic scent he knew as intimately as his own name. He held a half-smoked cigarette between his thumb and forefinger, a cheap double happiness he'd bought from a street kiosk, its acrid, throat-rasping smoke curling in lazy spirals towards the water-stained ceiling. He rarely smoked, a habit shed years ago, but tonight felt like an occasion for vice, a small, dirty sacrament for a failing God. On a small, scarred laminate table, his encrypted Osprey 7 tablet displayed a pixelated satellite image, a study in deceptive calm. The Osprey was a bespoke piece of kit, built for MI6 by a boutique firm in Cambridge. It had no branding, a matte black magnesium alloy case, and a screen that was polarized to be unreadable from any angle but straight on. It was cold and heavy in his hand, a slab of condensed secrets. The image it displayed was a sliver of the Pearl River Delta at 0300 hours, a sprawling sodium-lit amoeba of industry bleeding into the dark, oily water of Mears Bay. To a casual observer, it was just another Tuesday at the port of Yantian, a symphony of logistics playing out under a blanket of low, sulphurous cloud. To Julian, it was the sound of a fine crystal clock being smashed against a concrete wall. The ship, the Costco Fortune, a hulking Panamax-class container vessel whose blue hull was streaked with rust, wasn't supposed to be there. He cross-referenced the live AIS transponder data with the manifest he'd paid a dock worker with a gambling problem a small fortune to acquire. It was her, all right, registration number 9V7254. And she wasn't scheduled to begin loading for another 72 hours. His finger, the nail bitten to the quick, traced the heat-bloomed outline of a specific Liebherr container crane on the tablet's thermal overlay. It was active. A vibrant, angry orange bloom indicated its powerful 16-cylinder diesel engine was running hot. It was methodically, relentlessly plucking a series of identical, climate-controlled shipping containers from the dock and placing them onto the vessel's deck. Crate designation SZDO 771, Shenzhen Dynamic Optoelectronics. Inside each of those sterile white boxes, nestled in custom-molded, shock-absorbent polyurethane foam, were the components that had consumed the last year of his life. The tiny technological demons that London had codenamed Cerberus. Inertial measurement units. IMUS. The heart, soul, and insidious brain of any modern guidance system. The nervous system of a hypersonic predator. They were a sophisticated cocktail of vapor-deposited gold traces, quartz microelectromechanical gyroscopes, and hypersensitive accelerometers, all housed in a hermetically sealed casing no bigger than a matchbox. They were capable of telling a missile where it is, where it's going, and how to get there with pinpoint accuracy, even in a GPS-denied environment where jamming had blinded its electronic eyes. And these weren't the standard commercial-grade units you'd find in a high-end consumer drone or a smartphone. These were military spec, hardened against radiation, extreme G-forces up to 20,000 Gs, and the most sophisticated electronic warfare suites the West could throw at them. They were the key that could turn a rogue state's clumsy, inaccurate rockets into city-killing surgical instruments. The intelligence, painstakingly scraped from a compromised server in Tehran by a GCHQ division in Cheltenham, known affectionately as the Weavers, was unequivocal. A consortium of pariah nations, pooling their black market resources, had placed a massive, clandestine order. The manufacturer, Shenzhen Dynamic Optoelectronics, was a known front for the People's Liberation Army's Technology Export Division, a way for Beijing to arm its less savory allies while maintaining plausible deniability. And the shipment, the single most dangerous proliferation event of the decade, was moving 3 days early. Panic, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, tried to find a purchase in his gut. Julian forced it down with a practiced mental discipline honed over 15 years of this life, replacing it with the dull, familiar ache of professional dread. He snubbed out his cigarette in a cheap ceramic ashtray, the scent of burnt paper momentarily overpowering the room's other odors. For nearly a year, Operation Nightshade had been his entire world. A meticulous, agonizingly slow dance of recruitment, cultivation, and preparation. It was a masterpiece of patience, a house of cards built on a single, fragile human variable. Now, it was threatening to crumble into dust because some shipping clerk in Shenzhen had decided to be brutally efficient. He switched screens on the tablet, the biometric sensor reading his thumbprint in a fraction of a second. He pulled up the asset file. A single grainy photo, likely lifted from a company ID card. A man named Wei Jin, 42 years old, line supervisor on the Cerberus assembly floor. A face that was remarkable only in its sheer, unadulterated ordinariness. Thinning hair combed carefully over a pale scalp. Weary eyes that had seen too many 16-hour shifts, and the permanent slump of a man who had spent 2 decades standing on a factory floor. He was not a hero. He was not a dissident. He was a father. And his daughter, May, was dying. That had been their way in. Not ideology, not patriotism, not revenge. They had used the most ancient and reliable leverage of them all: love, weaponized by desperation. The MI6 Research Division, a nest of Cambridge-educated data miners and behavioral psychologists operating out of a quiet, lead-lined basement in Vauxhall, had found him. They had sifted through terabytes of stolen medical records, financial data, and scraped social media posts from across Guangdong province. They were hunting for the perfect storm of access, desperation, and psychological pliability. They found Wei Jin. His 8-year-old daughter, May, had a rare mitochondrial disease, Lee syndrome. The experimental treatment she needed, a gene therapy still in clinical trials, was only available at a private clinic in Zurich. The cost was astronomical. A figure so far beyond Wei's lifetime earnings, it might as well have been the distance to the moon. Julian remembered the first meet, the memory as vivid and uncomfortable as yesterday. He'd taken the high-speed train to Shenzhen, passing through the seamless, sterile border control, his cover as David Chen, a British electronics buyer, holding up to the cursory glance of the immigration officer. The meet wasn't in a shadowy alley. It was in the chaotic, screamingly loud food court of the MI6 shopping mall, a temple to Chinese consumerism. The air was a thick soup of Sichuan peppercorns, frying oil, the clatter of mahjong tiles from a nearby arcade, and the sharp chemical scent of knockoff perfume. Julian, looking the part in a slightly rumpled linen suit, sat with a bowl of untouched beef noodles, the broth cooling in the aggressive air conditioning. Wei had approached his table hesitantly, clutching a cheap smartphone like a talisman, his movements furtive and uncertain. "Excuse me," Wei had said, his Mandarin careful, formal, the accent of a man not native to the province. "Is this seat taken?" It was the agreed-upon code phrase. Julian had looked up from his own burner phone, offering a tired smile that he hoped conveyed weary camaraderie. "Only if you are looking for the Wuming train." Wuming. The nameless train. Wei had sat, his knuckles white where he gripped his phone. He didn't touch the lukewarm jasmine tea Julian had ordered for him. He was a man drowning in a sea of medical debt, and Julian was a man on the shore, casually holding a life raft. "My daughter," Wei had whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing, barely audible over the din of chattering families and shrieking teenagers playing games on their parents' phones. "I know," Julian had replied, his own voice low and calm, a carefully modulated instrument of reassurance. He slid a thin, unmarked tablet across the sticky table. On the screen was not a bank statement, but a detailed prospectus from the Zurich clinic. Doctors' names, treatment schedules, a high-resolution photo of a cheerful, sun-drenched children's ward overlooking Lake Geneva. Below it, 2 documents, their icons pristine. A Swiss medical visa application, pre-approved for one Mei Jin, and an employment contract for her father, Wei Jin, as a logistics consultant for a UK-based import-export firm, with a salary that would make his eyes water. It was a complete, fabricated new life, gift-wrapped and waiting. Wei had stared at the screen for a full minute, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning, terrifying hope. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice cracking. What do you want?" "We want you to fix a mistake," Julian had said. Choosing his words with surgical precision, it was the cover story they had spent weeks perfecting. "Your company is shipping a faulty product, a very dangerous product. A flaw in the Power Regulation Board could cause a cascade failure, a terrible accident. We need someone on the inside to replace a single, flawed component with a corrected version. It is a simple matter of quality control, of public safety." It was a beautiful lie, clean and simple. They weren't asking him to be a saboteur, a traitor to his country. They were framing him as a hero, a whistleblower, preventing a disaster. The human mind, especially one under the immense duress of a dying child, could build a palace of self-justification on a foundation that thin. The component itself was a masterpiece of clandestine engineering, developed by the clever boys and girls at Porton Down. It was what they called a parasitic capacitor. To the naked eye, and even to the factory's standard diagnostic tests, it was identical to the original Murata ceramic capacitor on the IMU's Power Regulation Board. It had the same capacitance, the same resistance, the same physical footprint, but it had a secret. It was constructed with a doped polycrystalline diamond substrate that was designed to degrade under a specific, combined set of circumstances. The immense G-forces and the rapid increase in thermal energy generated by a solid-fuel rocket motor. The conditions, in other words, of a missile launch. Under that specific stress, the parasitic capacitor wouldn't just fail. It would fail elegantly. It would begin to leak voltage, slowly at first, then with increasing speed, creating micro-arcing that would introduce catastrophic noise into the IMU's power supply. The guidance system wouldn't just go dark. It would go mad. It would receive corrupted data, feeding the missile's control surfaces a stream of computational gibberish. The missile would veer off course, tumble like a drunk, and, in all likelihood, destroy itself long before reaching its target. It was sabotage that looked like a simple, tragic mechanical failure. It was untraceable. Their communication method was just as clever. Julian's team had provided Wei with a burner phone, a cheap, anonymous model. On it was a single, offline game, a simple Tetris clone called Block Stack, complete with cheesy 8-bit music. But the game was a Trojan horse. Specific patterns of cleared lines, achieved in a specific order, an I block, a T block, 2 S blocks, unlocked a hidden partition in the phone's memory. Instructions would appear as game tips on the screen. Wei could send messages back by achieving certain high scores, which were actually encoded data packets that he could transmit via a one-time burst transmission function by covertly touching his phone to a designated NFC tag hidden behind a loose tile in a public restroom at the Luohu commercial city. The training, conducted in a safe house in Macau, designed to look like a drab apartment, had been agonizing. They had built a perfect replica of Wei's workstation. They flew in a disgraced former engineer from SZDO, now living in exile in Vancouver, to walk Wei through the process. He had to learn how to open the IMU's hermetically sealed casing using a specialized piezoelectric tool, the PZT-9, that vibrated at 200 kilohertz, creating microfractures along the seal that were invisible to the naked eye. He had to use a beryllium-copper non-magnetic screwdriver to remove the 4 microscopic M1.2 panhead screws holding the power board. Then, the most delicate part. Using a pair of anti-static tweezers to pluck out the legitimate capacitor and replace it with the parasitic one. The entire process had to be completed in under 90 seconds, while surrounded by colleagues and under the constant, unblinking gaze of high-resolution security cameras. Wei was not a natural. His hands, calloused from a lifetime of manual labor, shook uncontrollably. On the 3rd day of training, he dropped a capacitor. The tiny component, worth more than his car, vanished into the cheap shag carpet. The trainers spent an hour on their hands and knees with flashlights before finding it. Wei had stood by, pale and sweating, ready to quit. Julian, watching via a live encrypted feed, had spoken to him through a hidden earpiece. He didn't threaten. He simply said, "Think of the view from her hospital room, Wei. Think of the lake." And Wei, his jaw set, had picked up the tweezers again. Now, staring at the satellite feed of the Costco Fortune, its decks already filling with white containers, Julian knew the plan was in tatters. The timeline was everything. The plan had called for Wei to make the swap during the final quality control check the day before the original shipping date. It was the last time the IMS would be unboxed and handled individually before being sealed in the shipping crates. By moving the schedule up, the company had likely skipped that final, redundant check. The units were probably already in their crates, sealed with high-security locks, and on their way to the ship. Julian's own burner phone, a hardened Sonim device, buzzed with a single, sharp vibration. A new message. He tapped the block stack icon, the cheerful music a galling counterpoint to the dread in his stomach. He played the sequence. A long bar, a square, 2 L shapes. The screen flickered. A new game tip appeared in stark white text against the black background. Final cue. See cancelled. Crates sealed. En route to Yantian. I failed. It was from Wei. Julian felt a cold wave wash over him, a physical sensation like being submerged in icy water. Failed. The word was a death sentence for thousands of people in some sun-scorched city he'd never visit. He typed his reply, his thumbs flying across the virtual keypad, encoding his message into a series of Tetris moves that would translate back into text on Wei's end. Report everything. Where are you? The reply came back faster this time, a testament to Wei's panic. Supervisor dormitory, watching trucks leave. Feng is with them. Feng. Director Feng, the factory's head of security. A former Ministry of State security officer, a man with cold, dead eyes, and a reputation for paranoia that was almost supernatural. Julian had seen his file. Feng was the dragon guarding the treasure, and he was personally escorting the shipment. This was worse than Julian had imagined. The crates would be under constant, high-level surveillance from the factory to the port and onto the ship. The window of opportunity wasn't just closing, it had been bricked over and concreted. Julian stood up and walked back to the window, looking out at the endless forest of neon-lit skyscrapers across the harbor. He was a handler, a ghost. His job was to pull the strings from the safety of the shadows, not to be on the stage. But the rules had just changed. The entire apparatus of MI6, the weavers, the tech wizards at Porton Down, the strategists in London, they were all useless now. This had collapsed down to a single point of failure. Him and his terrified, untrained asset. He needed a new plan. A plan that was insane, impossible, and had to be executed in the next few hours. He needed to get Wei from his dormitory in Shenzhen, get him to the port, get him past MSS security, get a sealed shipping container open, and get him to the IMS. It was a suicide mission. He went back to the phone. He began to play the game, his fingers moving with a new, desperate urgency. He was composing the most dangerous message he had ever written. New instructions. Confirm you have the package. The package was the small lead-lined pouch containing the dozen parasitic capacitors. Wei was supposed to have returned it via a dead drop after the mission was completed. The reply was a single character, translated from a specific high score. Why? Yes. Good. Julian encoded. Go to the west gate. Now. A blue BYDE6 will be waiting. License plate GD57J38. Do not bring your phone. Leave it in your dorm. He was shattering every rule in the spy's handbook. Direct contact with an asset in the field during a crisis. Using a vehicle from their own local fleet, a car that could potentially be traced back to them. It was reckless. It was sloppy. But it was fast. And right now, fast was the only thing that mattered. He grabbed his go-bag from the closet. It was a battered canvas messenger bag that contained a set of fake IDs, a thick wad of cash in various currencies, a satellite phone, and a small, unassuming-looking toolkit. Tucked into a hidden compartment was his personal weapon, a SIG Sauer P229 Legion in 9mm. Its compact frame and custom G10 grips a familiar, cold weight in his hand. He was no longer a ghost. He was entering the game. He sent one last, encrypted burst transmission from his tablet to a single, heavily firewalled server in London. The message was short, encoded to be less than 256 bits. Nightshade compromised. Timeline accelerated. Going dark. Exfil Protocol Alpha on my mark. Protocol Alpha. The panic button. It meant an agent was in imminent danger of capture or death. It meant that if London didn't hear from him in 12 hours, they were to assume the worst, scrub his existence from their records, and inform his ex-wife that he died in a training accident. A clean, painless lie for everyone. He performed a thermite wipe on the tablet, placing it in a metal basin in the sink. He activated it, and the device flared with an intense white light and a sharp smell of ozone, melting its own circuitry into a useless slag of silicon and metal. He pulled the battery from his burner phone and snapped the SIM card in half, dropping the pieces into the toilet. He walked out of the apartment without a backward glance, the faint smell of noodles and failure following him into the humid Hong Kong night. The drive from Hong Kong to the Shenzhen border was a blur of neon and rising anxiety. Julian used a commercial crossing at Lok Ma Chau, his British passport and business visa identifying him as David Chen. The Chinese border guard, a young man with a bored expression, barely glanced at him before stamping his passport with a thud. The transition was immediate. The chaotic, vertical energy of Hong Kong gave way to the sprawling, utilitarian glow of the mainland. The blue BYDE 6 was where he'd told Wei it would be, parked in a dark, garbage-strewn alley a block from the factory's west gate. It was an anonymous electric car, one of millions in Shenzhen, chosen for its ubiquity. Julian slid into the driver's seat. The keys were tucked into the sun visor. The interior smelled of cheap plastic and faint desperation. He killed the interior lights and waited, the silence in the car amplifying the thudding in his own chest. 15 agonizing minutes later, a figure detached itself from the shadows of the factory wall. It was Wei. He moved with a hunted, furtive energy, his head on a swivel, a man convinced the world was watching him. He pulled the passenger door open and collapsed into the seat, breathing heavily, each exhale a ragged gasp. He was clutching a small, lumpy package wrapped in greasy butcher's paper. The capacitors. They're at the port, Wei gasped, his voice thin with panic. I saw the convoy manifest. Berth 9. They're loading it now. Director Feng is overseeing it personally. There are MSS agents everywhere, not in uniform. I know, Julian said calmly, his voice a low anchor in the storm of Wei's fear. He pulled the car away from the curb, merging smoothly into the sparse late-night traffic. He drove without lights for the first 2 blocks, a ghost moving through the sleeping industrial district. We're going to the port. Wei stared at him, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it was almost paralyzing. That's impossible. It's a sealed security zone. They have guards, cameras, biometric scanners. Yes, Julian said. He took a sharp right, heading towards the industrial waterfront, the distant silhouettes of the port cranes like skeletal dinosaurs against the bruised purple sky. Which is why we're not going in the front gate. He pulled the car into a derelict lot overlooking the vast, sprawling container yard. From their vantage point, they could see the Costco Fortune at Berth 9, bathed in the harsh glare of floodlights. The skeletal arms of the cranes moved with a relentless, methodical grace, lifting the white SZD-0771 containers onto the deck. Julian opened the go bag on his lap. He handed Wei a pair of dark blue overalls, identical to those worn by the port stevedores. Put these on. While Wei changed, fumbling with the buttons in the dark, Julian pulled out the toolkit. It contained several items that looked like standard electrical equipment, but were anything but. The first was a handheld device that resembled a power brick for a laptop. This was a digital ghost, a high-frequency RF jammer, tuned specifically to the 2.45 GHz and 5.8 GHz bands used by most wireless security cameras, powerful enough to create a small, localized bubble of static. The second was a magnetic EMP pulse generator, a small cylinder with a heavy base, a custom-built unit from Q Branch's less glamorous cousins at RAF Welford. The third was a sonic lockpick, a slender rod that vibrated at a precise, high frequency. Here's the plan, Julian said, his voice a low, urgent murmur. The containers are loaded, but the ship doesn't sail for another 2 hours. Before it does, the Port Authority has to conduct a final weight and balance check. A single inspector goes on board, verifies the container seals and weights against the manifest, and signs off with a digital stamp. That's our window. They will have a guard with him, Wei protested, his voice shaking. Yes, they will. And we are going to make sure that guard is very, very busy. Julian pointed towards a small power substation near the edge of the berth. A squat, windowless concrete building humming with electricity. That station provides power to the lighting rigs for berths 8, 9, and 10. I'm going to use the EMP generator to create a localized pulse. It will fry the fuses and trip the main breakers, and more importantly, it will fry the delicate electronic voltage regulators on the backup generators before they can kick in. For about 3 minutes, the entire area will be plunged into darkness. The guards will be disoriented, focused on the power failure. In that darkness, you move. Wei was shaking his head, a gesture of pure denial. Move where? The containers are sealed. They have high-security Abloy Protect 2 locks. The inspector has a master keycard for the electronic lock. Julian explained, his patience wearing thin. But the container itself has a secondary mechanical locking system, a series of internal bolts. That's where this comes in. He held up the sonic lockpick. It will vibrate the tumblers into place without turning a key. It sounds like a dentist's drill pitched for a dog, but in the confusion of a blackout, it will be just another industrial noise. He grabbed Wei's shoulder, forcing the man to look at him. The man was on the verge of breaking. Wei, think of May. Think of Zurich, the sunlight on the lake, the doctors. This is the last step. 90 seconds of work for a lifetime of peace. Can you do it? Wei closed his eyes, his breathing ragged. He gave a single, jerky nod, a man choosing the impossible over the unthinkable. All right. The inspector is a man named Chen. He's fat, lazy, and a chain smoker. He will do his checks on the lower deck first. Container SZO-771-8 is on the top deck, starboard side. You will have to climb. When the lights go out, you have exactly 3 minutes. That's the lifespan of the EMP pulse. 3 minutes. You get to the container, open the lock, find the crate with the master IMU units. It will be marked with a red tag, and make the swap. Then you get out. You don't seal the container. You just leave it. The confusion will cover your tracks. We meet back at this car. It was a plan built on hope and desperation, with 1,000 points of failure. But it was the only one they had. They left the car and moved on foot, sticking to the deep shadows at the edge of the container yard. The air was salty and thick with the smell of diesel fumes and stagnant water. They reached the perimeter fence near the power substation. Julian cut a hole with a pair of heavy, insulated bolt cutters. He handed the digital ghost to Wei. When you get to the gangplank, activate this. Hold it low against your body. It will blur the cameras just enough to make you a ghost in the machine. Don't turn it on until you're ready to go on board. The battery only lasts for 5 minutes. Julian moved towards the substation, while Wei crept along the shadows towards the ship. Julian could see him, a small, dark figure moving with a terrified resolve. He saw the port inspector, a portly man in a high-vis jacket, waddle up the gangplank, a bored-looking MSS guard trailing a few paces behind him. This was it. Julian pried open the access panel on the substation with a crowbar. He attached the magnetic base of the EMP generator to the main transformer housing. He took a deep breath and triggered it with a remote switch in his pocket. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. The towering floodlights overlooking the berth didn't just go out. They exploded with a sharp crackle, showering the dock in sparks. The entire section of the port was plunged into absolute, disorienting blackness. Shouts of alarm went up from the deck of the Costco Fortune. Backup generators sputtered and died before they could even fully engage, their electronics silenced by the electromagnetic pulse. Julian's part was done. He scrambled back through the fence and sprinted for the car, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Now, it was all on Wei. For Wei, the darkness was a physical blow. One moment, he was cowering behind a stack of pallets, watching the inspector board the ship. The next, the world vanished into a cacophony of shouting and the pop of exploding bulbs. He thumbed the switch on the digital ghost, the small device vibrating faintly in his hand, and ran. He scrambled up the gangplank, invisible in the chaos. On deck, sailors were running with flashlights, their beams cutting wildly through the darkness. The MSS guard who had been with the inspector was shouting into his radio, getting only static in reply. Wei didn't hesitate. He found a service ladder and began to climb, the rough metal rungs biting into his soft hands. He hauled himself onto the top deck, his lungs burning. He was surrounded by the monolithic white containers, silent giants in the dark. He scanned the designation numbers with a small penlight, his hands shaking so badly the beam danced. SZDO-771-4, 771-5. There. 771-8. He pressed the sonic lockpick against the heavy mechanical lock. He thumbed the switch. The device emitted a high-pitched whine that seemed to drill directly into his skull. For a terrifying 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then, with a series of loud, satisfying clicks, the internal bolts slid back. He wrenched the heavy door open and slipped inside, pulling it almost shut behind him. Inside, it was pitch black and freezing cold from the climate control unit. He fumbled for his penlight again, its beam cutting a weak path through the darkness. The container was filled with dozens of smaller, foam-lined crates. He scrambled over them, looking for the red tag Julian had mentioned. He found it at the far end, the master crate. He pried it open with a small crowbar from his pocket. Inside, nestled in perfect rows like deadly jewels, were the matchbox-sized units. His hands were slick with sweat. He pulled the pouch of parasitic capacitors from his overalls. He had 12. His instructions were to replace as many as he could. He took out the ceramic screwdriver. 90 seconds. He grabbed the first IMU, the PZT-9, to break the seal. A low hum. It popped open, the 4 tiny screws. His fingers felt like clumsy sausages. One of the screws slipped, falling into the dark foam. He cursed under his breath, his heart seizing with panic. Ignore it. 3 will hold it. He used the tweezers. Pluck out the old capacitor. Drop it. Pick up the new one. His hand was shaking violently. He guided it into place. He replaced the cover, tightened the 3 remaining screws, and placed the unit back in its slot. 1 down. He grabbed the next one. He was faster this time. Seal, screws, swap, cover. Back in the slot. He fell into a rhythm, the terror replaced by a frantic, mechanical focus. 3rd unit, 4th, 5th, 6th. A loud metallic bang on the container door made him jump so violently he almost screamed. A powerful flashlight beam cut through the crack in the door. "Hello? Anyone in here?" It was the inspector's voice, thick and annoyed. Wei froze, his blood turning to ice. He was trapped. He flattened himself behind a stack of crates, switching off his penlight, trying to control his frantic, ragged breathing, certain the man could hear his heart hammering against his ribs. The door creaked open further. The inspector's beam swept the interior. Wei could see his silhouette, a large man panting from the climb. "Damn power outage," the inspector grumbled to himself. Always something. He swept the light around one more time, then seemed satisfied the container was empty. He pulled the door shut. Wei heard the heavy thud of the bolts sliding back into place, followed by the decisive electronic beep of the keycard lock engaging. He was locked in. Panic, absolute and overwhelming, seized him. He was trapped in a freezer, in a box, on a ship that was about to sail for the Middle East. He scrambled to the door, pounding on it with his fists, his shouts swallowed by the thick, insulated walls. He was going to die in here. He was never going to see his daughter again. Outside, Julian waited. The 3 minutes were up. The lights in the port flickered back on. The backup generators finally kicked in. The shouting died down. But Wei did not appear. 5 minutes. 10. Julian's stomach was a hard, cold knot. He had sent the man to his death. Protocol Alpha was in effect. He should leave. He should run. But he couldn't. He thought of the grainy photo in the file. The ordinary man with the weary eyes. He had made a promise. He got out of the car. He started walking back towards the berth, a wild, suicidal plan forming in his mind. He was halfway across the yard when he saw it. A plume of thick, black smoke, billowing from a vent on the side of a white container on the top deck of the Costco Fortune. Then a different sound cut through the night. Not the broad, sweeping wail of a police car, but the high, frantic shriek of a shipboard fire alarm. The klaxon on the Costco Fortune began to blare, a deep, guttural beep, beep, beep that echoed across the water. On board the ship, locked in the freezing dark, Wei had given in to despair. And then a thought surfaced, born of pure animal desperation. In his pocket, he had a cheap, transparent plastic lighter with a panda on it, which he used for his rare cigarettes. It was an act of pure madness. He ripped open one of the crates he hadn't touched, pulling out the shock-absorbent polyurethane foam. He piled it up against the container wall near an air circulation vent. He flicked the lighter. He held the flame to the foam. It smoldered for a second, then erupted into a foul-smelling, toxic, greasy black inferno. The container's internal smoke alarm, a tiny, self-contained unit, began to shriek. That alarm was wired directly to the ship's main fire control system on the bridge. Within seconds, the ship's klaxons were blaring. Automated halon gas systems hissed to life. And, crucially, the emergency protocols dictated that all sealed containers in the affected zone be automatically unlocked to allow fire crews access. Wei heard the loud clank as the bolts on his door retracted. He threw his shoulder against it, stumbling out onto the deck into a scene of pure chaos. Sailors were running with fire hoses. Bells were ringing. He was just another worker in overalls, a face in the crowd. He scrambled over the side, slid down a thick mooring rope that scraped his hands raw, and hit the dock running. He didn't look back. He found Julian by the car, his face pale with shock. "What did you do?" Julian demanded, shoving him into the passenger seat. "I made a fire," Wei said, his voice a hoarse whisper. He was covered in soot, his eyes wide, and he smelled of burnt plastic. Julian just stared at him for a second. Then a slow, incredulous smile spread across his face. He gunned the engine, and they sped away from the port, leaving the chaos behind them. The exfiltration was a blur. Julian drove them to a quiet stretch of coastline north of Shenzhen. A Zodiac Milpro Hurricane, a fast, rigid, inflatable boat, was waiting, a dark shape on the dark water, manned by 2 silent men in black fatigues from the Special Boat Service. Wei was handed a passport with a new name. He looked at Julian, his eyes filled with a mixture of terror and overwhelming gratitude. "My daughter?" he asked, his voice trembling. "A private jet is waiting at a disused airstrip in Macau," Julian said. "She's already on it with a medical team. They'll be in Zurich in 15 hours. You've done it, Wei. You've saved her." Wei Jin, the line supervisor, the failed saboteur, the accidental arsonist, nodded slowly. He stepped onto the boat without another word and disappeared into the pre-dawn mist of the South China Sea. Julian watched until the boat was just a speck. Then he turned and activated his satellite phone for the first time. He sent a single, two-word message to London. Nightshade complete. 6 weeks later, Julian was sitting in a quiet pub in Kensington, the air smelling of stale beer, rain, and furniture polish. A man in a tailored Savile Row suit sat down opposite him. It was Sir Marcus Thorne, the deputy chief of MI6, a man whose quiet demeanor and kindly eyes concealed a mind like a steel trap. "The assets are settling in well in Geneva," Thorne said, his voice a low, cultured rumble. "The girl is responding to the treatment." Full marks, Julian. It was messy, improvisational, but the result is what matters. Julian nodded, saying nothing as he watched the condensation trail down his pint glass. "The intelligence from our friends in Langley confirms it," Thorne continued, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. "The consortium attempted a test launch 2 weeks ago from a site in the Dash de Cavir. 3 missiles. All 3 suffered catastrophic guidance failure within seconds of launch. One of them actually looped back on itself. It set their program back years. You saved a city, Julian." Julian took a long drink of his beer. It tasted flat. "And the fallout in Shenzhen?" Thorne's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Predictable. The Chinese are masters of saving face. An internal investigation was launched." He slid a thin manila file, cool to the touch, across the polished table. Julian opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a translation of a press release from the Xinhua news agency. It reported that a major internal security lapse had been discovered at Shenzhen Dynamic Optoelectronics. The factory's head of security, a man named Feng, had been found guilty of gross negligence and collusion with foreign industrial competitors. He had, the report stated, allowed substandard components to enter the production line. There was a single, black-and-white photo attached. It was a mug shot of Director Feng, his face bruised and swollen, his normally cold, dead eyes now filled with a look of utter, terrified bewilderment. He was a scapegoat, Julian said, his voice flat. "A necessary one." Thorne corrected him gently. "The official story is that he was executed last week. Treason. His family has been relocated to a vocational training and education center in Xinjiang province. The important thing is, their investigation is closed. They believe they've purged the traitor. They will never look for Wei." Julian closed the file. He had gotten Wei and his daughter out. He had saved them. He had sabotaged the missiles. It was a victory, by any metric of his profession. But as he stared out at the gray London rain, all he could see was the face of Director Feng. A ruthless man, perhaps, but a man executed for a crime he didn't commit. His family erased along with him. He had promised Wei that he was just fixing a mistake, a matter of quality control. He had sold it as a clean, moral transaction. But the truth, as it always was in this world of shadows, was far messier. He had simply exchanged one set of lives for another, trading a black piece for a white one on a board far larger than any of them could see. He finished his beer, the victory tasting like ash in his mouth. The game was over, but the ghosts, he knew, would remain.